We begin today in the Middle East, where the temporary truce between Israel and Hamas has expired. Fighting restarted today with Israeli airstrikes in Gaza and air raid sirens sounding in Israel. The exchange of hostages and detainees has halted and aid is cut off. In the hours before the truce was set to expire, both sides claimed that attacks were carried out by the other. Israel said it intercepted rockets from Gaza, and Hamas reported explosions and gunfire inside Gaza. U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken was in the region this week. He spoke with Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and other government leaders. And this is what Blinken had to say after those meetings.
I made clear that before Israel resumes major military operations, it must put in place humanitarian civilian protection plans that minimize further casualties of innocent Palestinians. But Israel has one of the most sophisticated militaries in the world. It is capable of neutralizing the threat posed by Hamas while minimizing harm to innocent men, women, and children. And it has an obligation to do so. Ultimately, that's not just the right thing to do, it's also in Israel's security interest.
I'm joined now by Lt Col Jonathan Conricus, a spokesperson for the Israel Defense Forces. Lt Col, thanks for joining us again.
Thank you for having me.
The fighting has resumed. You've heard what the Secretary of State, Mr. Blinken, had to say. The U.S. says they would hope Israel will conduct your offensive into mostly southern Gaza differently this time. How do you plan to change things? Do you plan to change things as you begin this next phase of your offensive?
Yes, what Secretary Blinken also said and wasn't broadcast here is that Israel definitely should defeat Hamas and eradicate Hamas. Not exactly his words, but the gist of it was take out Hamas and make sure that at the end of this war, Hamas doesn't exist. And that's an important thing to keep front and center, because that is what we are busy doing. And the details and the method by which we will do that will indeed incorporate the advice or guidance that has been given by the U.S. administration. We listen and we take notice, of course. And this has been the guiding principle all along, to get civilians out of the battlefield and to fight the enemy and the enemy only. And what we're doing this time is that we are perhaps more detailed and more granular in our approach. We have disseminated a map in Arabic for the Gazan population. This is kind of a zoning map at the neighborhood level, which will allow us to communicate our intentions to the people of Gaza, telling them ahead of time where there's going to be fighting and who specifically needs to evacuate. So it won't be a blanket statement of all of the people of Khan Yunis evacuate, but it'll be specific neighborhoods and it'll be very accurate. We're also very hopeful that the international community and specifically humanitarian organizations will be part of the solution and not part of the problem, but that they will help in facilitating aid to Palestinians that will be temporarily displaced, and to help create and sustain the humanitarian zone that we have erected in the northern part of Khan Yunis, which is also southern Gaza. So we're hopeful that this will be successful, and it is definitely our intention to fight the enemy and the enemy alone.
Okay, I want to focus a little bit on this map you've talked about, because I understand leaflets have been dropped from the air with a QR code that takes people to the map to show where the safe zones would be. Sort of in the past, as we've talked throughout this, it has been get out of northern Gaza, move into southern Gaza, and it was more broadly based in terms of where the fighting would be and where the safer parts would be. But we've seen in the past that you've identified Hamas targets in, say, the Jabalia refugee camp, which we spoke about. What happens if you identify Hamas in some of these more granular neighborhood areas where you're telling people to go? What is the calculation there? How do you approach that differently than what we've seen in the past?
So each case by its own considerations, and I cannot, commit to exactly what we will do in each case that we will be confronted on the battlefield. We know that Hamas wants to use the civilian population as their human shields. We know that Hamas actively takes steps in order to prevent the safe evacuation of civilians. And we know that not enough has been done on behalf of humanitarian organizations to facilitate the free flow of aid to the humanitarian zone. What we will try to do is, again, to facilitate that aid, to get people out. And when there will be an important military target, military necessity in juristic speech, that we would want to strike, we will take additional precautions and to try to be as specific as possible when we strike them. But we must be clear. There is a war going on, and we are fighting against a cynical and very brutal enemy that has no problems in sacrificing their own civilian population. And these are the words of Ismail Haniyeh and of Yahya Sinwar and other seniors in Hamas. They say themselves, we are a culture of martyrdom. We want our martyrs. And for us, it's no problem that people die because we believe in the cause. These are Hamas words, and that is what we are up against. And I think that we should be focusing on those practices as well as we're focusing on Israeli countermeasures and what we are doing. At the end of the day, the reason why civilians have been killed is first and foremost because they're held and forced to be there by Hamas. If Hamas wouldn't force them to be there, they wouldn't be there, and then we would be fighting Hamas and Hamas alone, and no civilian would be killed. And then the fighting would be very swift, and it would be a very swift victory over Hamas. But they are cowards, and they're cruel, and they're inhumane, and they're using their own civilians as human shields. And that is why Palestinians have sadly been killed during this war.
Well, let's just talk about victory over Hamas. And I take your point that they do use people as human shields, and we've seen their leadership do interviews where they said October 7th was a rehearsal, and they will do it again and again and again. So they are a persistent threat to your security. That's a given. But how do you know when they have been defeated? Like, what is the metric for when this mission has achieved its goal? Because I've seen estimates of 30 to 40,000 Hamas fighters. The leadership is dispersed around multiple countries and in multiple areas. We're not even really sure how many of them are in Gaza right now. So how does the rest of the world know when you've achieved that goal of eliminating Hamas? Is it 30 to 40,000 dead soldiers? Is it the entire leadership killed? Like, what is the metric for victory and the end of this fighting?
So the thing that is more tangible that we can speak about, one thing when you're fighting a war against an enemy, it's usually about breaking the enemy's will to fight. And if you ask any military professional, what is victory? It means that your enemy doesn't have the will to continue fighting. That's usually very elusive, and you only know after you have taken away the enemy's ability and will to fight, because he raises his hands and surrenders. It's difficult to say what will it take in order to achieve that. So what we can speak about in more specific, tangible terms are military capabilities. And in this case, tunnels, rockets, missiles, explosives, and the amount of enemy combatant that are in an organized military framework under hierarchy that are capable of executing missions. And we've done very good progress in northern Gaza. 11 out of 12 battalions have been significantly impaired in terms of their combat capabilities. Some of them are totally out of commission. Some still have some combat capabilities, and we will continue striking those as we speak. And for the other parts of Gaza, we will do exactly the same and perhaps more with the other battalions. At the end of the war, and this may take a while, it may not necessarily be a swift and short endeavor, but at the end of it, we will take out the combat infrastructure, the logistic infrastructure, and the political and administrative support system that supports Hamas' capability to fight against us. We may not be able to kill all of the seniors or capture them, and we may not get our hands on all of the enemy combatants. But there's a certain threshold after which you take out their command and control, their logistics, their ability to resupply and function freely. That is usually the tipping point in any fighting. And it's true if you're fighting an organized military, a nation-state military, or a army of terrorists like Hamas.
So the duration, obviously, to achieve those goals are very uncertain, right, as you said. And we have this civilian population, which is more than 1 million, I think it's fair to say. I've heard as high as 1.8 million displaced from northern Gaza into southern Gaza. I know you say you're going to drop these maps with a level of granularity of where they can go, but there's just not a lot of space left for that volume of people to seek safety, knowing that Hamas is embedded in the population down there. And you said you will shoot at high-value targets, using your decision-making process. They don't seem to be, the civilian population of Gaza, in a much safer position in this. If the fighting can continue for a long period of time, and just physically, sir, there's just no space for that crush of people for a war to be happening around them in any kind of a safe way.
I agree with you that it is a difficult situation, very difficult, and I feel for the people in Gaza who are not supporters of Hamas and are stuck in very difficult condition. I understand this is highly, highly inconvenient, and I'm sure even beyond that. But we don't really have a choice. If we don't finish this mission, if we don't take out Hamas, then they will come back, as you said, and try to do worse than October the 7th again and again and again. And it leaves us no choice but to finish the job with Hamas. We will do so while focusing on combatants, trying to spare civilians and keep them out of harm's way. It would be great, for the sake of Palestinian civilians, if Hamas understood this, came out of their tunnels that they're hiding underneath the civilians with their hands up, turned over our 137 hostages that they keep in Gaza, and tell us that they surrender unconditionally. That would spare all the lives. I don't think that Israel would continue fighting if Hamas did that, and it's up to them. But we are left with no choice. We listen to our enemy, we see what they did on October the 7th, and we understand that in terms of our commitment to defending Israelis, we have no choice but to eradicate Hamas and make sure that our civilians can live safely in their homes. If we don't, they won't be able to. And therefore, unfortunately, we have to continue. We're sacrificing our own soldiers. They are at risk, and there's tremendous destruction and killing, which is not what we wanted. Again, we didn't want this war and we didn't start it. It's been forced upon us. But at the end of the day, we have no choice but to fight this war and to defeat Hamas. If we don't, Israelis will not be safe, and that will be an unsustainable situation.
No choice, as you say, on your strategic objective of eliminating Hamas, but there will be a series of tactical choices that you will make throughout that process. And you've outlined how you're releasing this neighborhood by neighborhood sort of map to show where people can go. I know you've talked about...
And the humanitarian zone.
Right.
Super important.
Right, but in the past you've used text messages, for example, to SMS messages to alert people. The criticism has been they've come too late and the bombs came too quickly after that, and people didn't have time to go or it wasn't safe for them to move. So how much notice do you give? This is what they've said. You can dispute it if you want. But how much notice will you give people on the fighting, on this? Because going back to the crush of people in a very difficult small space that has been the subject of intense fighting, they need time to move.
Yeah.
So what is the advanced warning standard?
Yeah, I don't think that criticism is really fair, and I don't think that those who criticize us in that way can give even one single example of any other military that was fighting to defend its own civilians living just a few miles away, that gave any warning to civilians within enemy territory to evacuate like we did. And mind you, we provided 2.5 weeks of notice. We told Gazans in northern Gaza 2.5 weeks ahead of before we started to maneuver, we told them that we're going to maneuver. Right. I think that is ample time to move mountains, not only 1.1 million people, including evacuating hospitals and including evacuating people that are limited in their ability to move. But the decision was made by Hamas and by different UN organizations not to evacuate, not to listen to the warnings. And by doing so, they jeopardized the safety of those Palestinians. We gave warnings 2.5 weeks ahead of time, and we continue to warn. And even while we were fighting on the ground, we stopped the fighting for 4 and 5 hours every day in order to allow civilians to evacuate select areas where they were fighting. Frankly, I don't think that any other military has ever done that in modern times, and I don't think that criticism towards the IDF is fair.
So just a final point, sir. What you said earlier, that you would hope that humanitarian groups and aid groups will be part of the solution rather than part of the problem. You criticize them for not effectively delivering aid to people. The aid groups we've spoken with have said the fighting and the way the IDF has conducted things tactically has made it very difficult for them. Many of them have lost people, lost family members, been killed by the war in there. What is it you're saying the aid groups have done that wasn't appropriate here?
Yeah, of course, that's sad that people who work for organizations that are supposed to be providing humanitarian aid, and I'm sure many of them do, were unfortunately killed as part of the fighting. I cannot take responsibility for them. I don't know exactly where they were and what happened. I can only express sadness that they were affected by the fighting. They were definitely not targeted by us, but these things unfortunately happen in war. What I'm saying is that if you remember our previous conversations a month ago and a month and a half ago, when we issued our warning, please evacuate, the response that we got from UNRWA, from the World Health Organization, from UNICEF, and from Doctors Without Borders was, this cannot be done. You mustn't move people from the battlefield. Now the criticism is you didn't give them enough time. What I'm saying is that yeah, well, obviously it's always easy and in vogue to criticize Israel, but we are really trying to protect our civilians and minimize the damage to non-combatants. And that is why we have told them to evacuate and we have told them where to go. Unfortunately, instead of humanitarian organizations who are supposed to care for the humanitarian needs of the Palestinians and not to be a tool that eternalizes Hamas control over the Gaza Strip, they're supposed to help with that. And I fail to understand what their reasoning is. They understand that war is coming. They understand that if people remain in a combat zone, there will be casualties. Why on earth would you not help them? Why wouldn't you persuade them? Why wouldn't you put your vehicles at their disposal? Why wouldn't you evacuate hospitals ahead of time? Why wait for things to become severe and for these tragic, horrible scenes that we've seen over the last month and a half? Why do that? Only to use it against Israel as a way of a political tool and to help Hamas in their propaganda campaign? If people really care about the lives of Palestinians, then help us get them out of the battlefield. And we have provided not a perfect solution, but the best possible solution that we can give. And that's the humanitarian area where there's no Hamas infrastructure, so there's very little probability that there will be any fighting there. And that is where we have told people to evacuate. Now, if they would have put tents there and would have channeled all the internally displaced Palestinians there, that would have been much, much better. And it would have made it safer. And that's why we are still calling out. We're still asking for it and pleading with organizations, help us minimize the damage to civilians and get them out of harm's way. We are willing to compromise our own efficiency on the battlefield. We are advertising ahead of time where we're going to fight. Why isn't that seen as a real, genuine effort? And why aren't they in part of the solution instead of helping Hamas putting people in harm's way? I really can't understand it.
Okay, that is a much longer conversation. I've used up all of our time, but the aid groups would have a very different version of that, and perhaps we can discuss it at a future date. But Lieutenant Colonel Jonathan Conricus, a spokesperson for the Israel Defense Forces, thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me.